And so the Lord be with you.
And
And
also with
also
you.
with you.
Let us pray. Almighty God, you proclaim your truth and are engaged by many voices. Direct in our time, we pray, those who speak where many listen and write what many read, that they may do their part in making the heart of this people wise, its mind sound, and its will righteous, to the honor of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
That is a prayer for those who influence public opinion from our Book of Common Prayer. And I am going to, let's see, share my screen first. Here we go. So we're continuing our conversation about how to talk to kids about race. And we are continuing to use Dr. Jennifer Harvey's book, Raising White Kids. Last week, we talked about the introduction and the first two chapters. So we talked about good parents, hard conversations. We talked about moving from colorblindness to race-conscious parenting. And then the chapter, Where Do I Start? And this week, we're going to be talking about what does a healthy white kid look like? And I'm going to spend the bulk of our time on that particular chapter. And then we're also going to talk about, do we have to call it racism, and our bodies and racial scripts. So that is tonight's conversation. And just like last week, what is takeaways, and so I have today's in our slides with the hope that to kind of highlight what she thinks is the most important thing coming out of every chapter. And so I'm going to begin with an example that she has on page 97. This is an example that a parent is describing about their child. It says, I was so relieved when my second grader came home, excited about everything she had learned during her school's Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration. I'd worried about what she would be taught, and I was ready to fill in the blanks. Like, I figured they might sugarcoat things. But when my daughter came home, she was not only excited about what she had learned, but her school had done a great job. But then, after she eagerly shared with me all that she'd learned, my daughter said to me, you know what, Mom? I'm so glad we are white. And I thought, oh my God, do we say that? So this is highlighting the truth that it looks very different to talk about white pride versus Black pride or Latinx pride or Native American pride or anything like that. And why is that so? What is the broader context that makes that so? And she talks about how healthy white children, this is her description of what healthy white children are. And it's a little bit lengthy, but I want to read it to you just to make sure that I do her justice. Healthy white children are children who have been nurtured over time to be comfortable in their own skin, but who are also able to function well and appropriately in racially diverse environments. They are children who neither ignore nor pretend not to notice the racial identities of others, but who also do not make assumptions about people based on their race. They are children who feel equipped and have strong moral commitments to interrupt and challenge racism when they witness it, both in interpersonal and day-to-day life moments, as well as in its larger structural and societal forms. But then right after she says that, because when I read that, I was like, oh, that is not easy. When she's described as on the one hand, it's like, it's just full of contradictions. And that's exactly what she says in the next paragraph, that definition is full of contradictions, that you have to be this, but you also have to be that. And you have to be this, but you also have to be that. And how hard that can be. So she says that that white kids are being raised in and educated in a society in which they are located on top. And while I think that is sometimes a hard truth for us to digest, I do think it's true. And I think that it's a truth that we can recognize. She says that white kids are taught that they are treated better and that they are given messages about their superiority. Now, Are white kids being told explicitly, you are better, you're superior? No, right? But the context that we live our lives in sends these indirect messages. And so I'm thinking about all the different, this is kind of getting between the difference between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And I am thinking about how in our church right now, when we do our online services, we're doing these up close pictures of the stained glass windows, which are so beautiful. And we've received some comments from people being like, wow, I didn't realize just how white everybody was in our stained glass window until I started seeing these up close shots about it. And so that is true, definitely in our church iconography, although we've been working hard as a parish to try to introduce other types of art and expression that are not quite so white. But it is, there are church stories. A lot of times I have, at least with my kids, some Bibles and some books that do have people with different colors of skin. But the books that I grew up with, Jesus was really white and Moses was really white. And all of the disciples were really white. I think I'm thinking of that picture of Jesus knocking at the door. I don't know if y'all had this. I grew up in a Baptist church, so knocking at the door was, pretty standard visual. And with like blonde hair and blue eyes. So we have, even if nobody's been saying white is superior, white is on top, white is treated better, the card lines, the greeting card lines in the books that we read, in all these different ways, we've been receiving these indirect messages that white is the norm, that white is better. And so she says that just as humans develop physically, emotionally, intellectually, we also develop racially. And she says that I know that there's a whole area of study addressing this. One of my friend's mothers, who is probably in her 50s or 60s, has her PhD in this. And so it's not like it's a new fad of education. This is, racial identity and racial development is something that people have been studying for a long time. She says that race does not predetermine or predispose who we become or how we grow. Rather, there is a constant interaction between the internal selfhood and the external world. And that interaction produces certain tendencies in racial development. So she leans on a couple of different scholars in this area. One is Beverly Daniel Tatum, whose book I have here. It's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. And then she also leans on a woman's work, Janet Helms. Her book is called A Race is a Nice Thing to Have, A Guide to Being a White Person or Understanding White Persons in Your Life. I don't have that book, but I'm intrigued by its title. And Helms talks about 6 different stages of white identity. The different stages that she names are contact, disintegration, pseudo-independence, immersion, and autonomy. And these stages are not meant to diagnose behavior. So some of you might have been a part of a Sunday school class that Kathy Zappa and I taught last year about the Enneagram. And we talked about how tempting it is when you're learning about the Enneagram to try to type the people in your life and say, oh, he must be a 2, she must be an 8, different things like that. But that's not what these stages are for. They're not meant to be a diagnosis. We're not supposed to go around and say, oh, he's in the reintegration stage, or she has totally disintegrated. That's not helpful. And it's not meant to be linear. So you may be familiar with the different stages of grief. I think we have 7 stages of grief. Does that sound familiar? I think that's just because 7 is a great number maybe, but we have these different stages of grief. And for a while there was this idea that those stages were linear, that you had to, there was a time when you were kind of in shock. There's a time when you're in anger. Then there's a time when you're able to really grieve. And there's a time when you're able to make peace with things. And but truly, when it comes to grief, those things are not linear. you may be in a really integrated space where you can feel your emotions and still feel like you are able to move on one day, and the next day you may feel totally incapacitated by grief. And that is normal and healthy. So the same is true of these different stages of white identity. They are not linear. We might be in a stage of immersion one day and then fall into a stage of disintegration afterwards, which speaks to the idea that this is lifelong work. She says that development is a constant process, and unless we are continually active on the journey, we can easily move backward into earlier stages of development and understanding. I think this is why it's so important that we have multiple opportunities for anti-racism training, or for intentional learning times, or for book groups, or various things, because we are always learning and we are always growing. And so it's not just like we do this one thing at work and we're done. We are no longer anti-racist because we got that training checked off the list. So I want to take a closer look at these 6 different stages that she talks about. And the first one that she names is moving from contact to disintegration. And this is when somebody starts to realize, wait a second, we're not equal. So last week we talked a lot about color blindness and the difference between color blindness and race-conscious parenting. This is that stage where you realize that even though everybody might look the same under their skin with their muscle tissue and their vascular systems and all that kind of stuff, that we aren't all equal because we don't live in an equitable society. We are treated differently. And she says we disintegrate because we have an encounter in which the moral dilemmas posed by racism become impossible to ignore or deny. And that disintegration often brings stress, and that it's a state of high dissonance. So this is that moment where you've been told your whole life that life is one way and you've been able to live in that reality, and then all of a sudden you're faced with this other truth, and it makes you feel like you've been living a lie the whole time. Or when a person can either put on their blinders and regress back to the contact stage, or they can move forward to the next stage, which is reintegration. And even though reintegration is a better, more developed stage than disintegration, it is still not quite arriving, because it's a space where we have a tendency to blame people of color.
Not very
So she says, if I attempt to reintegrate, I have no choice but to explain the experience of people being treated differently because of race by justifying it in some way. So this idea that I've worked hard for, my family has worked hard for what we have, and there's no such thing as white privilege. And, it is possible that you've worked really hard for what you have, and there's still white privilege. So moving that reintegration stage is where we're starting to acknowledge some truth, but we want to justify it in a way that puts the blame on people of color. So then the next stage is pseudo-independence. And it's where we are able to say something is wrong with society. And I think this is a stage where a lot of us get kind of stuck, right? Because it requires a little bit, it allows us to name the truth and see it, but not necessarily have to do some of the more independent work. And it's where white people conclude that if racially disparate treatment does exist, then the prior framework was wrong and our systems must be unjust and inequitable, which is true. Our systems are unjust and inequitable. And so she says, recognizing racial injustice as structural and perpetuated by white people is an opportunity for intellectual growth, because so that is like you are developing forward. It is a stage of intellectual growth, but she also talks about how sometimes our intellectual growth and our emotional growth don't happen at the same pace. And so our intellectual growth may be moving faster than our emotional growth can catch up with. And when that happens, that anger and fear and shame, be stuck in that place of white guilt that we hear a lot about. And I think, you know, white guilt is normal and predictable. The idea is that we just can't get stuck there. And I have a lot of really close friends that are kind of stuck in that stage where for the first time it's like the wool is being lifted from their eyes and they are seeing, oh my goodness, these racial injustices really do still exist. But every time they hear something about it, it feels like a personal attack on their person. And they aren't able to move past that. They're just stuck in that stage of guilt. She says, ironically, increased awareness and concern about racism can actually immobilize white people because we become more aware of the risk of saying or doing something racist and more conscious of harm this causes people of color. So maybe you know some people in this place right now. Maybe you are in this place right now. I know I am so often in this place right now where I'm so afraid to say something that's going to be offensive. And I'm thinking, especially like if you've just done an anti-racism training at work, you might be hypersensitive to, oh my gosh, well now I got to be careful what I say around this person, or I got, you know, this could be interpreted this way. And so you just kind of shut down instead of engaging. And that can be more of an affront than actually engaging. And she says that living in that stage of guilt and fear is not only unproductive, but it's also exhausting, which makes nobody wants to walk around carrying that weight of guilt all the time. I think that this is especially true of adults more so than with kids, because whatever framework we are coming from is one that we have held on to for a longer period of time. And so moving out of that framework requires more of us. Whereas kids who are constantly developing are more adept at that transformation. But sometimes we get so comfortable in what is familiar that anything that challenges that structure can really rock our world and make it hard to move forward. So the next stage is immersion. And it's changing my relationship to whiteness. So this is the space where we get to ask ourselves, who do I want to be? Who do I want to be? Knowing everything that I know, now that I've, you know, my way of life has been challenged, the way I viewed the world has been transforming. Given all of that, who do I want to be now? Who do I want to be in response? And she says, we begin to realize that actively committing to anti-racism changes the experience and the feel of that relationship to whiteness. So instead of our relationship to whiteness being one of guilt and shame, that it is something that can motivate us to help affect change in the world. So it's channeling that guilt that we feel to change. And that is how we get out of that stage. It's how we get unstuck. And it's when our emotional understanding and our intellectual understanding catch up with each other. You can know that you are in that stage if you can receive critical feedback without feeling totally deflated or threatened. And I gave the example this morning of the last time I was in Virginia, we went to a Black Lives Matter gathering that some folks in town had organized. And I had called it on my Facebook feed. I had said that we were going to be going to this peaceful protest, which is what the people that had organized, that's what they were calling it. It was a peaceful event. And one of my clergy colleagues, who's done a lot more work in this area, said, please don't call it peaceful. There's no peace until there's justice. Please call it nonviolent. And you know, at first I was like, what? Like, how dare she tell me what to do? But then I was able to hear it and say, okay, yeah, you're right. There is no peace until there's justice. And so now I'm really careful about my language around that. And anytime I talk about protests or other events, I try not to use the word peaceful because we're not there yet. There's still work to be done. So things can be nonviolent, but try not to use that word peaceful. So being able to take that critical feedback and learn from it rather than just bristle against it. And she talks about how when we get to this immersion stage, it's not just good for people of color for us to move past white guilt and start doing something about it. It's good for us too, because none of us wants to just be stuck in that stage of guilt and shame forever. So it's good for white people and it's good for people of color. And then finally, the most integrated stage is the stage of autonomy, which is an ongoing journey. And she says that it is, quote, like having our feet firmly planted on the ground in a more holistic way. We remain continually open and desirous of learning. We seek to constantly learn from people who are different from ourselves because we know we will grow if we do. So we're willing to put ourselves into those situations where we're going to come up against difference, where we might say something wrong, where we might, do the wrong thing, but we're willing to put ourselves in those situations because we know that even if growth can be painful sometimes, that it's also beautiful and good, and we want to continue to learn and grow instead of shying away from those opportunities. So in thinking about this specifically with kids, she says that our children need to be taught that their whiteness does position them in specific ways relative to racism and their relationship with children of color. But on the other hand, so we really want our kids to feel comfortable in their own skin. I know the first time we tried to have a more explicit conversation with our 5-year-old, his response was, "But I like who I am." And so we realized that we were communicating the idea of whiteness in a way that made him feel an innate sense of guilt for who he was. And so we had to say, like, we love how you're created too. We love who you are. And because you are who you are, and because you are white, we need to use that whiteness to be able to partner with and stand up for Black people and others who are not being treated well because of the color of their skin. I don't know that he got that, but we're going to have to just keep sharing that message until it's something that he's developmentally able to really take on. So she kind of makes this most succinct when she says, "We are clear that we cannot downplay the power of racism in our white lives, but we are also clear that racism doesn't have to have the last word in our white lives either." So I'll say that again. We are clear that we cannot downplay the power of racism in our white lives, but we are also clear that racism doesn't have to have the last word in our white lives either. So this means I have agency, and I can learn, and I can stand up for people, and I can do better. There's agency involved when we say that we don't have to be, it's important that we understand what our whiteness means, but we don't have to be reduced to just that. And she says that just as we continually commit ourselves to things like good nutrition and exercising regularly and all these different things that we would do to try to be a healthy human being, that we also have to constantly attend to a healthy racial identity. That is a practice that is active and dynamic and has to be constantly attended to. So I wanted to share this example that she shares about her 5-year-old. And it's a story that has to do, so she has 2 children, and then her sister also has children who are adopted, and one of the children is Black. And so the mom, Jennifer, was telling this story, was talking to her 5-year-old, and this is the conversation they had. "I was telling my 2 children about a racial incident their 5-year-old cousin experienced at his after-school program. A child had a bag of Doritos and was letting all the kids in the class come up and smell them. Yes, that delicious Dorito smell. But when T, her black nephew, came up. The boy stopped him and said, "Not you. You can't smell them. You're black." I wasn't surprised when my kids expressed sadness and anger after I told them about T's experience, but I was surprised, pleasantly, when I asked them how they would have handled the situation had they been present. In response to that question, my white 5-year-old said, "Well, I'm thinking that the kid who did that was probably a white kid. If that kid was white, then I think a white person needs to tell him to stop. So I would have said to that boy, 'Don't talk like that. That's mean.'" And so her daughter's reaction to her cousin's experience indicated that she could see that the person's behavior had to do with whiteness and that her response would also need to take into account her own whiteness, which is pretty developed for a 5-year-old, right? I think that that's a really good thing. It's something that we can all work toward. So she also talks about at the beginning of the book or the beginning of this chapter where you had the child who said, "I'm so glad we're white." She gave some examples of things that a parent could say in response to that. And I just wanted to share that with you too, because I think that these examples are are grounding. They're concrete and helpful. So she said, you could say, "I'm so glad you're you. And yes, you and I are white. But what makes you glad we're white?" And just posing that question. She says, "From here in an open dialogue, there is a strong likelihood that the specific privileges and protections her daughter had noticed or learned about will be named. And that this can then easily lead to a conversation about the mother's and the child's values about fairness. The same things that make you feel glad you're white are actually ways of being treated that I want for everyone. Black people, Native Americans, and Latinx people. So the fact that I sometimes get treated better because I'm white makes me kind of sad. I'm glad you are you, but I want everyone to be treated well, not just white people." Very age appropriate and very true at the same time. Any thoughts on that so far? on those 6 stages? Okay. So, oh, well, let me just say about that last statement that I just made. I think that one of the things that's helpful about her example is that in all of these examples is that the answers that she gives are always, rather than just an answer that ends the conversation, like this is the truth, this is what's right, end of story. They're always answers that encourage more discussion. And that kind of speaks to the importance of partnering with our kids in our learning. So in chapter 4, she talks about, do we really have to call it racism? Do we have to use the R word? You know, can we just talk about people being mean or people being unfair? And so she says, we might understandably fear making our kids overly sensitive by giving them words that seem big and scary. In fact, offering them language for the experiences they are already having is much more likely to cultivate their sense of agency and empowerment. And she gives this example of talking to her daughter about a situation where she was at school and the kids were choosing who was going to be on what teams for some kind of game. And somebody was like, "You can't play, you're a girl." And so she was addressing it with her child earlier in the day, just talking about how did that make you feel? That wasn't very fair, that kind of thing. But was kind of unsatisfied with her conversation with her child. It was nagging. She didn't want to introduce the idea of sexism because she didn't want that to define her child's existence in that classroom. But at the end of the day, it was still nagging her. And so she finally went back to her child and said, that conversation we were having earlier, there's a word for that. We call it sexism when girls are treated differently than boys or women are treated differently than men because of the fact that they are a girl or a woman. And this idea that girls can't do the same things boys do. And the relief that her child felt having this word to name what she was already experiencing. And the sense of empowerment that her child received in being able to know what it was and therefore address it instead of constantly trying to figure out, why am I being treated this way? she was given a word that named it and helped her to be able to identify it so that she could address it. So she talks a lot throughout the book and in other times when I've heard her speak about the importance of partnering with our kids. And so in this kind of dialogue that we have back and forth, she says that one of the ways to find balance is to listen carefully and follow our children's lead in terms of how we pace things and different things like that. That as we engage them in the work of recognizing and developing an understanding of racism and always act against it, our posture should be exploratory. We should stand next to them as partners. We should ask questions and offer insights about racism as ideas rather than right answers. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the end of the last chapter, that it's a way, it's constantly trying to have the conversations in ways that leave the conversation open. And she demonstrated that even in how she went back to a conversation she had with her child earlier in the day, where she wasn't satisfied with the results of it. She felt like there was something that was still missing. And I think that's helpful for us to remember too as parents, that once we have a conversation, we can always revisit it. That first of all, we want to keep the conversation open so that there's this mutual exploration going on, but also that once the conversation is over, it's never really over, that we can always open it back up and return to it. She says that we can be simultaneously deeply unsure and yet decide to engage anyway. And that as we practice, we will find ourselves becoming increasingly capable and facile in the moment. And so I think that that's true of, I mean, we can think of that in other contexts and in other kinds of conversations that we might have where, I mean, I'm thinking about, this is a totally different kind of situation, but like when you're applying for a job or you're asking for a raise and like you're really scared to ask for what you're worth because you don't want to scare the employer off. And the more you have that conversation, the easier it gets. So the same is true with any conversation skill that we're taking on, including talking about race. She says that it's important to teach white kids not just about racism, but explicitly white people's participation in racism. And that if the goal is to raise kids who are empowered to tackle racism, it stands to reason that they too need to see themselves as having the capacity to do so. So if we don't name white people's role in racism, then we don't give our kids the agency to work against it. Instead, it just feels like this thing that exists exterior to them and not something that they can have agency in. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well. One of the things that can be slippery about this is that when we talk about wanting to make sure that our kids feel a sense of agency, we don't want to do it in a way that paints people of color as victims and white people as saviors. That I'm a white person, I can rescue this black person from this horrible situation. That we need to be able to talk about our agency as white people in responding to racial injustice, but not in a way that disempowers people of color. We want to empower white children to be able to speak truth to racial injustice, but we don't want to do it in such a way that makes the white person the center of the solution or disempowers their black peers. And she says that one of the ways that we can do this is to teach our kids about past and present sheroes and heroes. And, you know, top of my mind, of course, right now is John Lewis. That this is a great opportunity for us to talk to our kids about the legacy of a man who had never tired of doing the work for racial justice. And so it's important to give them access to those role models, past role models, people who have gone before us, and present role models, black role models and white role models. Because it's important for us, for our white children, for people raising white kids to be able to lift up Black people as great examples, and as so that white people can see that Black people have been working to affect this change powerfully for decades, and for white kids to be inspired by that work and to want to be more like John Lewis. And it's also important for them to see how white people have partnered in that work well. So to have both past and present, Black and white heroes and sheroes to lift up. That is the chapter talking about how it's important to name racism explicitly. Does anybody have any thoughts on that before we proceed?
Lauren, I've been thinking a lot about kind of when I first remember like race or being white. And I remember in elementary school learning about Black History Month. And I came home kind of wishing I was Black, because thinking about like, oh, how terrible white people treated them and Black people overcame all of these things, and like, what have I ever done?
Yeah.
Was kind of how I interpreted it.
Yeah.
So I think hearing that piece about having stories about white people in that struggle, I think for me as a kid would have been really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's helpful, Sierra. Thank you.
So Lauren, your comments about introducing new concepts really resonated for me. And I actually was just whispering to Ella that when she was younger, I really struggled because there were a few things that were happening with her in school. And I really didn't want to introduce the concept of sexism in STEM. And in no way did I ever want to plant the idea that women, girls would not be as good in science and math as boys. And yet, I face sexism in STEM all the time. And so that concept of being scared of introducing something that and kind of implying that something is true when the lesson that you're trying to teach is actually the exact opposite. Right? So if you talk about racism and you say, well, sometimes Black people are not treated as well as white people, or treated as being inferior, you don't want to introduce the concept that they're inferior. So
Right.
How do you name the concept without introducing that idea? I don't know. I don't think I ever sorted that out exactly.
Well, I think it is such a struggle, because we're afraid that we will somehow speak the truth into being, right? And so
Exactly.
I think it's just so important to remember that truth is already out there, that we wouldn't be speaking anything into being that isn't already existing for our kids. And that if instead we can just give them the framework how to respond to what they're already experiencing. But and I think that a lot of it is just because we only get to see them a few hours a day, waking hours a day. And so there's just so much that we don't see in their lives that it can be hard for us to imagine what they're encountering and what they're not. And it makes us shy or timid that we will somehow introduce something that they haven't encountered yet.
Yeah, it's so age dependent too, right? I mean, as I say, like, it's so obvious at 14 that Ella and I can talk about all of these things, because I'm so confident that she's encountered all of these things. And when she was 5, I was pretty sure she hadn't encountered any of them. So how is a parent supposed? Go ahead.
I would say, or not all of them. I won't say none of them, but definitely not everything.
Yeah.
But how do you know, is it, you don't want to, I don't know. It just, it feels that there's so much gray space in there, right?
Yeah. Right. And so I think that's where she talks about how that's why it's important to partner with in conversation with the kids and ask them, like, why do you think that is? And see if their response demonstrates that they have some concept of racial unfairness, or if that has touched on them at all yet. and just like, that's an interesting idea. Why would you do it that way? And just ask them questions that help you understand where they're coming from so that you can keep that conversation alive. But rather than trying to read their minds and wonder, what they've seen and what they haven't seen, just keeping that conversation open. She's going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to have a few examples in this next chapter, which Ella, this chapter was what I was talking about last week when you asked your question.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that it is going to give you like an easy answer or anything like that, but I just wanted you to know this was the chapter I was thinking about when you asked your question.
Lauren, one quick comment and question. I thought your discussion of victimhood was exceptionally powerful. And I think it's incumbent on us, since we do, we have enjoyed the privilege of being raised white, that not only do we need to not act in a way that communicates that we're the savior and the person of color is the victim, but go beyond that to affirm the behaviors, the beliefs, the capabilities, all of the characteristics that we enjoy and have enjoyed onto the people of color with whom we interact. And it's a hard conversation. I've spent many years. I mean, I started when I first graduated from college. I was a military officer, and probably 2/3 of my division were Black people, right? And here was a kid from Ann Arbor, Michigan, is about almost as white as it comes, graduating in from college in the early 70s. And I was thrown into this environment for which I had no explicit training, but I had, fortunately I was raised by parents that I think were pretty much along the lines of the color blindness approach, which was, for that day was pretty good. But I've learned, and I have many of my business colleagues today that are people of color. And I have found situations where others, and inadvertently myself, of course, from time to time, you say things and you do things that aren't in the spirit of what we're talking about here. And I've found that if I can try to affirm, positively affirm all of my colleagues, I try not to set different standards for anybody that I work with, but it's hard to know where the lines are today, because I think they're shifting. And I think for the most part, they're shifting for the good. But I think it's something that we have to, vigilance is to not encourage anything that is victimhood is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been thinking that maybe the easiest way for me to try to find that delicate balance and maybe how to voice it to my own kids is, instead of, because I always want to say that we stand up for people, but I'm thinking maybe instead of saying that we stand up for our Black friends who aren't treated the same, that I say we stand with, because Black people can stand up for themselves.
Yeah.
And we stand with them. Does that make that, just that maybe that little nuance might be something that
That's
I
good.
kind of keep as a mantra in my own head to check my place in any situation, but also that's maybe a way that my kids can kind of wrap their heads around it. All right, so we're going to talk about our bodies and racial scripts. And I'm going to lean more on the racial script side than the body side, just for the sake of time, which actually, what time is it? 8:47, okay. And so she says that whatever our unique personalities, commitments, beliefs, geographical locations, and unique individual identities, all of our lives unfold within a larger racial story. And that this story began long before our individual lives began, and that the story continues to be written daily. So this is just part of remembering that we are always part of a bigger narrative, that we are always simultaneously our own individual selves, and we are always part of a bigger story. And recognizing the tension that sometimes exists between the larger story and the selfhood. I was sharing this morning about how some of the examples in my own personal life where I have felt that dissonance between who I am as an individual versus who I was in the big script, and basically, like, because I had lived in Texas and Virginia and Argentina and Maryland and West Africa and North Carolina and New York, like that I feel like I carry this whole breadth of cultural and even linguistic diversity with me, but that is not what people see when they look at me. They see the bigger picture. In fact, I can remember a time when I almost really resented, kind of similar to how Sierra was saying earlier, that she came home from school wishing that she'd been a Black person. There are multiple times when I have wished that I had looked as ethnic as I felt internally, just because of all of this experience that I've had, that it is not ever anything that anybody's going to be able to see about me when they first encounter me. And so we are always simultaneously in this tension between who we are as an individual and a person, and how we get, how we are part of a larger narrative, and how that can sometimes limit us. She says that kids of color in the United States are already more likely to live lives in which they learn to relate to and engage and work with white people. But that white kids, on the other hand, are being raised by white adults whose social networks are 91% white. And that's not a made-up statistic. She cited it. So it's a real statistic that white adults have social networks that are 91% white. And of course, that's going to vary geographically. But even living in Atlanta, that has one of the, the larger percentages of Black people in the country as a city, that's still very true of my life. And I hate that. So she says that without specific work to counteract the power of racial scripts, the power of this like larger scripts that we are a part of, whether we want to be or not, racial scripts that just leaning on diversity is not enough. So we talked about this a little bit last week too. And she says that children engage. This is a longer quote that I'm gonna share with you because I want to do it justice. Children engage, imitate, and respond to adult modeling much more than they do to what adults say. Children perceive, feel, and internalize adults' affect, energy, and behavior. They integrate these non-cognitive perceptions into their sense of reality, and do so at levels much deeper than they do the explicit teaching adults offer them. As a result, diverse environments cannot fundamentally change the racial dynamics in and experiences of white children and children of color's lives. Children experience their friendships in the context of the same racial tensions and larger alienation that adults do. Simply put, adults haven't figured out how to address and reduce racial tension among ourselves. How could this not impact our children's relationships with one another? So even if we are explicitly naming race and we are explicitly putting our kids in diverse situations and all of this, that at the same time, if our experience as adults is that our social networks are 91% white and these different things, that we are still struggling to know how to talk about and engage race in our own lives, that it's impossible to expect that our kids aren't going to experience that same difficulty and intention, not just because they're our kids, but also that all the other kids in their classrooms have that same framework that they are receiving from their own families. That they are also growing up in homes where it's difficult to talk about race, where in white homes that the parents are mostly surrounded by white people, in homes of color that they're experiencing more diversity than the white families are, but still are often predominantly segregated in these different more Black spheres. And that if that is our world, that no matter what we say, that it is that's still going to be that framework, that racial script is always going to be there, that bigger narrative is going to be true alongside this individual explicitness that we are trying to instill in our children, that we are trying to develop them as wonderful individuals who have their own voice and their own personalities and all of that. And there's also this larger script that is always present. And so, Ella, that's what I was thinking about with your question last week, that, why is it that, you being in DC and being in a more diverse place that a lot of us might feel kind of jealous of, that we wish that we had for our own children. And that you're obviously growing up in a home where you're talking about racially explicit things or talking explicitly about racial things, because you're the only non-adult, almost adult on this call. So your family is doing all the things that it should be doing as far as anybody knows. And yet you're also part of this bigger picture, this bigger script, this bigger narrative, where we as a society are still struggling to be able to talk about this with grace and excellence. And so that is also true, and is also affecting the extent to which your friend groups continue to divide along racial lines.
And it's not, I notice it, especially because I've grown up in such a diverse area, but it's not something that, to be perfectly honest, like I don't always know why it happened that way. It just, I don't really know. It's not something, I don't wish it was that way. I wish everything was intermixed, but it sort of just happened that way.
Yeah.
Kind of hard to grapple with.
Yeah, and some of that is just the systemic racism, but we don't want to just blame that, right? But it is. I mean, that's why, this woman's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Eating in the Cafeteria Together, talks about, well, a lot of the kids are eating reduced fee lunches, and so they're all in the cafeteria. And this was true when I was a youth minister in Charlotte. That one of the high schools there, they called the cafeteria Africa, because all of the Black kids ate in the cafeteria and all the white kids ate outside. And one of my high school students had a sit-in. They had a bunch of white kids sit in the cafeteria to try to introduce. I mean, so she was able to see it as a teenager and want it to be different, in the same way that you say, I wish it were different. And it's important that, I mean, I don't think that that's useless. I think that there is fruit to us naming it and trying to change it. And yet that's part of the reason why this is an ongoing journey, because it's not like we can have, schedule this one really great event to highlight the disparity and it'll go away, because there's always going to be this larger script at work. And so we have to do the individual work, but also the large script work too. We have to really work on how to be able to talk comfortably about race and engage it as an individual, and be able to find ways to address systemic racism. And I think that this is probably one of the biggest challenges that parents have, because we want to be able to introduce our kids. I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but we want to be able to introduce our kids to these diverse experiences, and yet we want to do it in a way that is fair to our children and the people that we're introducing them to. And we want to do it in a way that honors the humanity of everybody involved. And it's just hard.
Want to?
Okay.
There was
It's
just
not going to make it any easier.
Elle and I were just talking also about kind of recognizing some of the different cultural experiences that she's had. So she's played lacrosse for a long time. And on her current lacrosse team, there's one girl who's Black, and I think one girl who's Asian, and the rest are white.
She's half Chinese.
Yeah, half Chinese. And then Ella tried out for a volleyball team. She'd never played volleyball before, but walked into volleyball tryouts. And your volleyball team is
Predominantly people of color.
I was going to say at least 2/3 Black,
or people, or like Latinx.
Yep, or Latinx, exactly. And the difference in the two experiences was really fascinating, in going between these cultures. And there were literally times where Ella would go from one practice to the other, and understanding the cultural influences that have made, opened doors, or maybe just preferences, or we don't know exactly, but it really is pretty striking to go from one practice to the other.
And maybe it was only half of my volleyball team, but compared to my lacrosse team, it was
a stark difference.
It was a very noticeable stark difference. And so
and again, it's a cultural thing, right?
So I want to share
Ella, let me ask you a question.
Okay.
Did you find that the common shared experience of the sport created an environment where it was easier for you to get to know the other racial participants as people, and maybe get a better understanding of who they were and the kind of cultural characteristics that were different?
Yeah, I think it did. I think the fact that we were spending time together, and we had to, volleyball is not a one-person sport. There's 6 people on the court, and so you have to work together, and you all have the same goal. And so I think, I do think if I think about it that way, I think it definitely did make a difference. But I was also, everybody on my team was very open, and we just wanted to play the sport. So I think that did help.
I think sports are a great space for that. We're already at 9:00, so if people need to hop off, go ahead. This is being recorded, so you can always catch up later. But because you mentioned lacrosse, it made me think of when I was coaching lacrosse in Baltimore, and I was working at a predominantly like 99% Black school. And so my lacrosse team was all Black, with the exception of one Asian girl and one white girl. And so whenever we would play a game away, which like the first away game we played was the first time we played on a marked field, because our field wasn't even marked for the first 8 practices of the season. And so we would go and play an away game, and we were the only Black team in Baltimore County, which is a huge lacrosse place. And the coaches from the other team and the parents from the other team would be like, "Oh my gosh, those girls are so lucky to have you," because that was their perception, just reading it off the surface. But whenever we would play a home game, the other teachers and parents would come up to me and say, "Oh my gosh, you are so lucky to have those girls," because they knew that the girls that were on my team were like some of the best, most courageous, bright, wonderful girls in the whole school. And so it was just always interesting to see what people thought they saw. And so that goes back to that racial script, right? Like the racial script was, oh, those poor Black kids that are getting introduced to lacrosse, this is so cool. And so that was the larger narrative. But the specific narrative was that I had these amazing, amazing girls on the team. No matter what color they were, that had nothing to do with it. They were just amazing bright girls that are all changing the world as we know it. I think that what Ella's talking about speaks to this last point, which is about how we experience race in our bodies. And so you can think about, like, when you talk about the difference of how you felt going to lacrosse practice versus volleyball practice, like, we feel when we walk into a room where we are a minority, we feel that in our bodies. But it doesn't happen that often. So we don't feel it as bodily as our peers of color feel it constantly walking into spaces that are predominantly white spaces. And so she says, nurturing healthy white children means we need to seek out spaces in which our children can experience being a demographic minority, so they can feel that bodily difference. But then she also, names that I'm not suggesting parents use people of color in their organizations to teach racial lessons. And I'm also not suggesting that white people fall into the racist trap of trying to go find a black friend. That this is another way of seeing people of color that is reductive and uses people for our own white ends. And so I have been in spaces before where I have been like, man, I need to, just scroll through Facebook and try to, like, figure out, like, who are my black friends so that I can spend more time with them, so that my kids are around black kids more. That is not helpful. That is using my black friendships to achieve an end with my white children. It's not useful. And yet, we were talking about this morning, like the difference between wanting to be intentional and being somehow contrived. And Buzz had a great, we engaged this morning about how the difference of motivation, what's motivating us in that moment. But I think it's really hard, the delicate balance between trying to desegregate our lives and decenter ourselves and our children as white people, but in ways that aren't contrived or take advantage of people of color. And so she talks about one of the ways that we can do that if we happen to be, especially in spaces that there just is less diversity and that it would be contrived to find it, is she says, the daily habit of engaging the voices, perspectives, and productions of people of color in media, art, literature, news, scholarship, and many different kinds impacts not just what we think, it potentially changes what we feel in the world as we move through it after being shaped by such engagement. And so it's really important for us as adults to diversify the information that we get. When we think about, like, last week we were talking about how it's important that we have books on our kids' shelves that talk specifically about race, that's one of the things that can give us the language that we're looking for. It's also really important that we have books that have nothing to do with race, but still have black kids as the protagonist, so that we're not just reducing the influences of color in our lives to things that talk about race. And I gave the example of one of my close clergy peers who was a black woman, and how she was kind of interviewing at this church, trying to decide if it was a predominantly white church, and she was trying to decide if it was a place that she wanted to be. And she sent her brother to go check it out incognito, and he was warmly received, and she felt really good about that. But then she was looking at all of the guest speakers that this church brings in, because they have great speakers that they bring in all the time. And she noticed that anytime a black person spoke, it was about something around social justice, and never something about, like, contemplative spirituality or raising our children, or anything it was always something that was considered to be a black topic. And she was like, we have other gifts. we are more than social justice experts. And so the importance of, as adults, seeking out voices of color, not just pertaining to topics of color, but seeking out voices of color in any area that we find an interest in, whether it's history or science fiction, or one of my favorite books that a group of girlfriends and I read while we were all on maternity leave together was Dropping the Ball, which is just about you know, trying to get over some mom guilt and not trying to do everything. And the woman who wrote it is a Black woman. And she wasn't just giving a Black perspective, she was giving a mother perspective. And so I think that that is one of the ways that we can try to keep that kind of diversity present in our lives in ways that are real and true without taking advantage of people of color in our lives. So I'm going to unshare the screen because I want to show you these two books since we're talking about that. So here's a book. These are both available in the bookstore. All Are Welcome. This is a book that talks about difference in race. So this is one that, and it's cool. I discovered today that if you take the jacket off, that it is a really cool poster. So I'm excited about that. But then also this book, in contrast, Ruby Finds a Worry, has nothing to do with race whatsoever. But it has this darling girl, Ruby, who is Black, who is the protagonist. And so it's really important for us to have both of those kinds of things on our shelves for ourselves and for our children. So next week, we are going to talk about, what's next week? I gotta go back to my slides to remember. Diversity is confusing. What does resistance look like? And the conclusion, a just racial future. So I will confess that I have not actually read those 3 chapters yet. We are now caught up to where I am in the book. And I am on vacation this week, but I'm looking forward to reading those along with you if you're reading the book. If not, don't worry, I'll fill you in next week. So any closing comments, realizing that it is 10 past 9? Any succinct closing comments that anybody wants to share before we close in prayer? All right, well then, let's pray the Lord's Prayer together. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Our Father, who art in
Who
heaven,
art in heaven,
hallowed be
Hallowed be thy
thy
name.
name.
thy kingdom
Thy
come,
kingdom come,
thy
thy will be done
on earth.
on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us
Give
this
us this day
Today our daily bread.
and forgive us
And our trespasses,
as we
forgive those who trespass against us.
lead us
And
not
lead
to
us
temptation,
not to
deliver us
temptation,
from thine
but
is the
feel evil,
power,
wisdom, the power, and the glory, forever.
forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
all right. Thank you, friends.
Great vacation.
Yeah, enjoy your
Enjoy
vacation.
your vacation.
Yay, vacation.
You've earned it.
Hope you get some AC back.
Week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good night.
Night, thanks.